And welcome to Houston Newsmakers Extra. I've been talking with Professor Richard Stoll, a political scientist, professor at Rice University. Dr. Stoll, thank you for continuing this conversation. I introduced you to as a scholar of international conflict. That seems to be made for this day, this time right now. What do you make of this? How do you study what's going on now? And what do you talk to students about in terms of how they do the analysis of what's going on?
Okay, so two things. One, I'm currently teaching the Introduction to International Relations course at Rice University, and we cover a wide variety of topics, but I've been starting out each lecture by sort of a brief recap of what's happened in Ukraine since the last class and trying to bring to bear some of the things we know from studying conflict in international relations to what we're seeing in Ukraine, putting it in a larger context. Most of my own work is sort of very broad-based, like looking at all the crises since the Cold War. Mm-hmm. Are they in any way different than the crises, let's say, that involving the United States during the Cold War? So I am not an geographic area specialist or, a Russian specialist. I'm pretty much of a generalist.
So when you look at what's going on now, when you say, are there similarities between what happened in previous conflicts and that sort of thing, are there any similarities to from years past to what's going on now?
Well, I think, it seems to be the case that and I'll say the Russians rather than Putin as a single person, mm-hmm. Because even if you say, well, this is all his idea, he had to get a reasonable consensus within the government of Russia at the highest levels to do this, okay? And maybe it's like, we don't want to mess with this guy, but they had to at least agree. I think we see, a pattern of they started this with the idea that for several reasons, it was going to end very quickly in their favor. That number one, their military was far superior to Ukraine. So in terms of that part of the equation, they were going to win. Number two, that I suspect they believed that the government of Ukraine was not exceedingly popular with a lot of the people in Ukraine. And it's not that they would necessarily greet the Russian troops as liberators in the eastern Ukraine, where people are more sort of oriented towards Russia. Yes, maybe, but just that people wouldn't support this government. So I think they underestimated the Ukrainian government and the Ukrainian military, and that is a pattern that we see. Not all the time, but it's certainly something that repeats itself in history.
So I don't think that's been talked about very much. What you just said about there was an indication that there wasn't a tremendous amount of support from the Ukrainian people for the current government. I guess that's kind of surprising to me. I guess that kind of went under the radar for a lot of for the layman, if you will.
Right. Well, for most of us, the things that affect, I'm going to sound like a political scientist here.
That's okay.
Most Americans, most of the time, are domestic things. What about my job? Am I going to get a pay raise? How much am I paying for rent? And this is, that's the way it should be for most Americans. And one way that we see this is about 5 or 6 times a year, one of the major polling agencies asks Americans, what's the most important problem facing us? And there's, you can basically say what you want. They give you some category. There may be like 40 or 50 categories. Typically, if we add up all the people that picked anything related to foreign policy, it's less than 20% of the American public. Mm-hmm. Okay, so quite rightly, most of the time, most of the people in the United States are concerned with domestic issues. So I don't find it surprising that a lot of Americans said, well, what's the deal with Ukraine? It's not, they have higher level concerns, as they should, for what's happening to them domestically.
What is the conversation to be had about whether or not we as Americans want to support something that's going to take a defensive position against someone who seems to be trying to destroy democracy. I mean, we, in our own country, we still talk about democracy as an experiment, which sometimes doesn't stay on the right track in many ways. But do you think there's a sentiment? I don't know if you've seen studies about any sentiment about how much Americans are willing to go ahead and sacrifice on behalf of democracy in another country, in another part of the world.
Can be some general support for that. Again, for most of the American public, and this is absolutely not a criticism of what concerns people. You know, what happened in the Ukraine was a total surprise. You know, what is this Ukraine thing? You know, why is Putin doing this? There is something of a tendency to you know, at least for a period of time, if not necessarily, you know, say, well, I'm going to support the president no matter what he decides to do, to at least give the president some leeway. Now, if this situation continued on for a long period of time, it appeared to turn against the United States, and we suffer costs, and we are going to suffer some, right? There are going to be some economic costs to trying to isolate Russia. I think it's incredibly unlikely that we would commit U.S. forces to this. But if that happened and Americans started to die, that would turn the American public ultimately against the president. But in the short run, it's not so much necessarily supporting it, but sort of, well, I'll let the president do this for a while. You know, I have to worry about other things.
Right.
But after a while, if it doesn't seem to be working and it appears to be hurting, then the president, any president, has trouble with the American people.
Okay, so now as we finish up, I want you to put on your political scientist hat and talk to John and Mary Public and tell them what is it they should be paying attention to as it relates to the Ukraine conflict.
I think what we should be very interested in is, of course, we want it over. We want the suffering of the Ukrainians to end. You know, what happens that could be at least construed by the Russians as less than a total defeat? You know, what can they pull away from this that says, well, you know, we got something out of it? I think that is going to be the key to resolving it. Now, we may disagree about that, you know, that, well, you really didn't. But I think the Russians have to come out of it saying, you know, this worked to some extent. We did get something positive out of it.
Perhaps some of the land, maybe Eastern Ukraine land that already was kind of like in the hands of those who were fighting against it, you know, maybe they claim that as part of, like Crimea. Maybe they claim that like they did Crimea.
Yeah, you know, clearly, if those two areas in Ukraine were allowed to become independent, that they could claim that as a victory. I don't think that's incredibly likely, but if it at least appears that those areas will be allowed to be at least somewhat more independent of the central government, then the Russians could at least say, aha, we made a better life for those pro-Russians living in eastern Ukraine.
Dr. Richard Stoll, I feel like I'm ready to take my test on international conflict now. As long as you make it multiple choice, I think I can make it.
Okay.
Thank you for your comments this morning. We really appreciate it. This is Houston Newsmakers Extra. I'd like you to share it with everybody you know.